The unraveling of innocence. Aisha Bennett walked briskly through the damp streets, her white recital dress fluttering slightly in the cool evening breeze. The weight of the cello case in her hand was nothing compared to the exhilaration that still buzzed in her chest. The night had been hers, a flawless solo performance at the city's prestigious Academy Hall. It was the culmination of years of dedication, hours of practice, and countless sacrifices made by her and her father. The intricate braids that adorned her head were not just a hairstyle, they were a legacy. Her father, Marcus Bennett, had spent over an hour that morning weaving them with meticulous care, a ritual they shared before every major performance. For Aisha, the braids symbolized their bond, a mix of love and tradition that carried her through the most challenging moments of her young life. The city lights reflected off the slick pavement as she turned onto Ashton Avenue, the quiet street that led to her neighborhood. She loved this part of her walk, where the noise of the city faded and the world felt still. But tonight, something felt off. A low hum caught her attention, a police car engine idling just behind her. She didn't look back, but her pace quickened, her heart thudding in her chest. Inside the patrol car, Officer Derek Malone leaned forward in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he observed Aisha. Malone was a veteran cop, but his years on the force had warped his perspective. He'd convinced himself he was a protector of order, but in reality, he'd become a judge and jury, deciding guilt based on the flimsiest of reasons. Tonight, Aisha didn't fit his idea of who belonged in this part of town. Her pristine white dress and immaculate braids seemed out of place, and Malone's suspicion flared. What's someone like her doing here? He muttered under his breath, straightening in his seat. The quiet hum of his engine broke as he flicked on his lights and pulled alongside her. Aisha froze as the red and blue lights bathed the street in their harsh glow. Her stomach sank, but she forced herself to keep walking. Maybe he would pass, she thought, but deep down she knew better. "Hey, stop right there," Malone barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Aisha halted mid-step, her pulse racing. She turned slowly to face him, her grip tightening on the cello case. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her stomach. "What are you doing out here?" Malone demanded, stepping out of his car. His boots splashed in a shallow puddle as he approached her. "Where are you headed?" "I'm walking home from my recital," Aisha replied, her tone calm but firm. She gestured to the cello case in her hand. "I live just a few blocks away." Malone's eyes flicked to the case, then back to her face. His expression hardened. "Let me see some ID." Aisha hesitated. She'd heard stories about interactions like this, stories that rarely ended well. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" she asked, carefully choosing her words. "Empty your bag," Malone snapped, ignoring her question. "On the ground, now." Her fingers instinctively tightened around the strap of her case. "Sir, my sheet music will get ruined in the rain," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You're not cooperating," Malone shot back, his tone rising. "Are you carrying drugs or weapons? Those braids, gang affiliation, right?" The accusation hit her like a physical blow. Aisha's breath caught, but she refused to let her composure falter. "I'd like to call my father," she said, reaching for her phone. Before she could finish her sentence, Malone lunged forward, snatching the phone from her hand. "That's it," he growled. "You're resisting." Aisha's world seemed to tilt as he pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The cold metal encircled her wrists, biting into her skin as he snapped them shut. Her cello case fell to the ground with a dull thud, the latch popping open to reveal her carefully arranged sheet music. The rain, now heavier, began to soak the delicate pages, turning them into a soggy mess. Malone hauled her toward his patrol car, his grip firm and unyielding. Aisha's mind raced as she stumbled forward, her thoughts a blur of fear and disbelief. She glanced back at her cello case, lying abandoned on the sidewalk, its contents ruined by the rain. The ride to the precinct was silent, save for the occasional crackle of Malone's radio. Aisha stared out the window, her mind replaying the events of the night. Her chest tightened as she thought about her father. How would he react when he found out? She knew he would be furious, but not just because of what had happened to her. He'd be furious because he understood the bigger picture, the systemic bias and abuse that had led to this moment. At the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the holding area. Aisha sat on a cold metal bench, her hands cuffed in front of her. Her white recital dress, once a symbol of her triumph, was now damp and wrinkled. Water dripped steadily from her clothes, forming a small puddle at her feet. Malone watched her from his desk, his pen tapping rhythmically against the surface. He'd expected her to cry, to plead, to beg. But instead, she sat there, her chin held high, her gaze steady. Her silence unnerved him, though he'd never admit it. A knock on the door broke the tense silence. Malone looked up to see a barber standing hesitantly in the doorway, a small kit in his hands. "Standard procedure for gang suspects," Malone muttered, waving him in. The barber hesitated, his eyes flicking to Aisha. "Officer, she's just a kid," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just do it," Malone snapped, his patience wearing thin. The barber sighed and opened his kit, pulling out a pair of scissors. Aisha didn't flinch as he approached her. She sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the wall in front of her. The first snip echoed loudly in the room, followed by another and then another. Her intricate braids, woven with care and love, fell one by one into her lap. Tears welled in Aisha's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give Malone the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she'd focused on the sound of the scissors, letting each snip fuel the quiet fire of resolve burning within her. By the time the last braid fell, the room was silent. The barber stepped back, his face etched with guilt and shame. Aisha reached down and gathered the severed braids in her hands, cradling them as if they were pieces of herself. Malone turned away, suddenly unable to meet her gaze. For the first time that night, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. But before he could dwell on it, the precinct door swung open, and a commanding voice filled the room. "What the hell is going on here?" Captain Monroe's voice boomed, cutting through the tension like a knife. Malone froze, his heart skipping a beat as the captain stormed into the room. Behind him stood a man whose presence radiated authority and power, Aisha's father, Marcus Bennett, and in that moment, Malone realized he had made a grave mistake. The weight of consequences. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly as Marcus Bennett strode into the precinct, his polished black shoes striking the tiled floor with measured precision. He moved with an air of authority, his tailored suit impeccably pressed, but his expression betrayed the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. A man who had spent years dismantling criminal enterprises, Marcus was not one to be easily provoked, but tonight, something deep within him burned. The sight of his daughter, sitting on that cold metal bench with her braids severed and her white recital dress soaked, was a picture that would haunt him forever. "Captain Monroe," Marcus said, his voice low and controlled, though every word carried the weight of thunder. "We need to talk, now." The captain, a grizzled man with decades on the force, nodded stiffly. He motioned for Marcus to follow him into his office, leaving Officer Malone standing frozen at his desk, his pen hanging midair. The door to Monroe's office closed with a heavy thud, and the muted voices of the two men could be heard through the thin walls. Malone tried to focus on the paperwork in front of him, but his hands trembled. He could feel the weight of Aisha's gaze from across the room. She hadn't spoken a word since she'd arrived, but her silence spoke volumes. Inside the captain's office, Marcus leaned over Monroe's desk, his fists clenched. "Do you have any idea what your officer just did?" His voice was still calm, but the restrained fury in his tone was palpable. Monroe sighed, running a hand over his face. "I've only just been briefed. Believe me, Marcus, this wasn't standard protocol." "Protocol?" Marcus cut him off, his voice rising. "You're going to tell me this was a matter of protocol. cutting my daughter's hair, arresting her without cause, humiliating her because she dared to walk home from a recital in her own neighborhood. Monroe held up a hand. Listen, I'm not defending Malone's actions. What he did was wrong, and there will be consequences. But you need to understand something, Marcus. This precinct isn't as clean as it should be. There are officers here who've been compromised, some by bias, others by money. It's a mess, and Malone, he's just one symptom of a much bigger problem. Marcus straightened, his eyes narrowing. Then you better start cleaning it up, Monroe, because if you don't, I will. The tension in the room was thick as Marcus turned to leave, but before he reached the door, Monroe's voice stopped him. Marcus, I need you to keep this contained. We're stretched thin as it is, and if this gets out... It's already out, Marcus said coldly, without turning back. What happens next depends on how you handle it. A father's fury. Marcus stepped back into the holding area, his gaze immediately locking on Aisha. She stood as he approached, her head held high despite the obvious humiliation she had endured. Her chopped hair framed her face unevenly, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes that made Marcus's chest tighten. He reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Are you hurt? He asked softly, his voice a stark contrast to the rage that had consumed him moments earlier. Aisha shook her head. Not physically. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He nodded, his jaw tightening as he glanced at Malone, who was now avoiding his gaze. You'll have to answer for this, Marcus muttered under his breath, loud enough for Malone to hear. Malone shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. As Marcus led Aisha out of the precinct, he felt the eyes of every officer in the room on them. Whispers followed their departure, but Marcus paid them no mind. His focus was on his daughter and the fire now burning in his gut. He had spent his career dismantling corrupt systems, exposing powerful criminals, and navigating dangerous networks. But this was personal. The silent drive home. The car ride home was steeped in silence, save for the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers clearing the rain. Aisha stared out the window, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the glass. Marcus glanced at her from the corner of his eye, searching for the right words to say, but none came. What could he say to undo the damage that had been done? Finally, Aisha broke the silence. Why did he do it, Dad? Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter. Because some people let fear and ignorance guide their actions, he said after a moment. Malone saw your confidence, your success, and instead of celebrating it, he chose to tear it down. That's on him, not you, but it feels like it's on me, as she said quietly. Her voice cracked slightly, and Marcus's heart broke at the sound. I didn't do anything wrong, but I feel small. Marcus pulled the car over to the side of the road and turned to face her. Listen to me, Aisha. You are not small. You are not weak. What Malone did was an attempt to strip you of your dignity, but he failed. You're still here. You're still standing. And you are stronger than you will ever be. Aisha nodded slowly, her father's words sinking in. She reached up to touch her uneven hair, her fingers brushing against the rough edges. I just wish Mom was here, she whispered. Marcus's throat tightened. He reached over and placed a hand over hers. She is here, he said softly. In you, in everything you do. And she'd be so proud of you right now. A plan takes shape. By the time they reached home, Marcus's mind was already racing. He couldn't let this go unaddressed. Not just for Aisha, but for every young person who had faced similar injustices. Malone was just one officer, but Marcus knew he represented a larger system that needed to be held accountable. As Aisha went upstairs to shower and change, Marcus headed to his study. He sat down at his desk, pulling out a folder labeled Grayson Network. Inside were years of notes, surveillance photos, and intel on one of the city's most elusive criminal organizations. Marcus had been working undercover for 3 years to dismantle the network, a web of corruption that extended into law enforcement, politics, and beyond. Milhone's actions that night had been fueled by prejudice, but they also risked exposing the delicate operation Marcus had been orchestrating. The Grayson network thrived on the city's division, preying on vulnerabilities created by systemic failures like the ones Malone had just displayed. If word of Aisha's arrest got back to Grayson, it could compromise everything. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed a secure line. "Captain Monroe," he said when the other man answered. "We need to meet. Tonight." The beginning of a reckoning. Later that night, Marcus met Monroe in a dimly lit parking garage. The captain leaned against his car, his face shadowed under the harsh overhead light. "What's this about?" Monroe asked, his tone wary. Marcus held up a USB drive. "This is everything I've collected on the Grayson network so far. You said your precinct isn't clean. Well, this is your chance to do something about it." Monroe hesitated. "You're asking me to risk my entire career." "No," Marcus said firmly. "I'm asking you to do your job. You let officers like Malone act unchecked, and this is what happens. People like Grayson thrive because no one holds them accountable, but we can change that." Monroe took the USB drive, his expression unreadable. "And Malone?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "He doesn't walk away from this unscathed. Not after what he did to my daughter." Monroe nodded slowly. "I'll see what I can do." As Marcus drove home that night, he knew the battle ahead would be long and dangerous. But he also knew it was a fight worth waging, not just for Aisha, but for every child who deserved to walk through their city with their head held high. A new kind of battle. The morning sun struggled to break through the dense grey clouds over the city as Marcus Bennett sat in his study, staring at the files spread out before him. His desk was a battlefield of papers, photos, and notes, all pieces of the massive puzzle he had been working on for 3 years. The Grayson network wasn't just a criminal empire. It was a fortress of corruption, greed, and exploitation that extended far beyond the streets. And now, thanks to Malone's actions, that fortress was under threat, not because it was close to being toppled, but because Marcus's cover could be blown before the mission was complete. Upstairs, the sound of soft piano music floated down. Aisha was at her piano, her fingers finding solace in the keys. Marcus paused, closing his eyes and letting the melody wash over him. It was one of the original compositions she'd been working on before the recital, but now it carried an added weight, a quiet strength born from the events of the previous night. The music grounded him, but it also reminded him of what was at stake. Aisha was strong, but she was still a child. She shouldn't have to bear the weight of systemic injustice on her shoulders. And yet, Marcus knew she wasn't the only one. How many others, young black girls and boys, had endured similar treatment without a father like him to fight for them? The thought fueled his resolve. A knock at the front door broke his concentration. Marcus rose, his movements deliberate, and opened the door to find Captain Monroe standing on the stoop. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp. "May I come in?" Monroe asked, his voice low. Marcus stepped aside, leading the captain into the study. Monroe's gaze swept over the organized chaos of the desk before settling on Marcus. "I reviewed the files you gave me," Monroe began, his tone cautious. "And you're right. The Grayson network's reach is deeper than I thought. But it's not just them. We've got officers in this precinct, my precinct, who've been on their payroll for years." Marcus leaned against the edge of the desk, his arms crossed. "And Malone?" Monroe sighed. "He's not directly involved with Grayson, but his actions are part of the problem. Officers like him create the environment Grayson thrives in. The racial profiling, the unchecked biases, it all feeds into the same cycle of fear and division." "And what are you going to do about it?" Marcus's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Monroe hesitated. "I've already started an internal investigation, but if I push too hard, too fast, it could backfire. We need to be strategic." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Strategic won't help my daughter reclaim her dignity. It won't erase the humiliation she endured." "No, it won't," Monroe admitted. But if we're going to dismantle this system, we need to be smart. And for that, I need your help. A father's choice. The weight of Monroe's request lingered as Marcus watched the captain leave. He returned to the study, his thoughts racing. Infiltrating the Grayson network had already cost him more than he cared to admit. Time with his daughter, his peace of mind, and now possibly his anonymity. Adding an internal police investigation to his workload would stretch him even further. But then he thought of Aisha. He thought of her sitting on that cold metal bench, her braids scattered around her like fallen leaves. He thought of every child who had been taught to lower their gaze, to keep their head down, to endure, and he made his decision. The first move. That evening, Marcus sat across from Captain Monroe in a secluded corner booth of a diner on the edge of town. The smell of coffee and fried food filled the air, but neither man touched their cups. "You want me to go deeper into this?" Marcus asked, his tone measured. "You want me to use my cover to root out the officers working with Grayson?" Monroe nodded. "You're already inside. You're the only one who can do it without raising suspicion." Marcus leaned back, his eyes fixed on the swirling steam rising from his coffee. "If I do this, Malone doesn't walk away. I want him held accountable." "He will be," Monroe assured him, "but we need to move carefully. If Malone suspects anything, he could tip off the wrong people." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Fine, but I'm doing this my way." Monroe raised an eyebrow. "And what does that mean?" "It means I'm not just going after Grayson's network. I'm going to make sure the next officer like Malone thinks twice before acting on their biases." The next target. Marcus's first task was to solidify his position within the Grayson network. Nathaniel Grayson, the enigmatic leader of the operation, was a man of charm and cunning. He ran his empire like a legitimate business, with layers of insulation to protect himself from law enforcement. Grayson trusted few people, but his right-hand man, Victor Steele, was his gatekeeper. Victor was a different breed, cold, calculating, and brutal. Marcus had crossed paths with him several times while building his cover, but now he needed to get closer. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Late one night, Marcus received a call from Steele. "Bennett." Steele's voice was clipped. "Grayson wants to see you. Tomorrow, don't be late." The line went dead before Marcus could respond. Face to face with Grayson. The following day, Marcus arrived at Grayson's estate, a sprawling mansion surrounded by manicured lawns and high walls. The guards at the gate waved him through, and a silent butler led him into the study. Grayson was seated behind an ornate mahogany desk, his fingers steepled as he regarded Marcus with a faint smile. Victor stood to the side, his expression unreadable. "Bennett," Grayson said, his tone warm but laced with an undertone of menace. "I've heard good things about you. Efficient, discreet, loyal." Marcus inclined his head. "I try to be." Grayson leaned forward. "But loyalty is something that needs to be tested. Don't you agree?" Before Marcus could respond, Steele stepped forward, a manila folder in his hand. He dropped it onto the desk, and Grayson slid it across to Marcus. "Inside are the details of your next assignment," Grayson said. "It's a simple delivery, but it's also a test. If you pass, there's more work waiting for you." Marcus opened the folder, scanning the contents. It was a delivery of cash, thousands of dollars in neatly stacked bills, to an address in the South District. A drop-off that would undoubtedly lead to something bigger. "Understood," Marcus said, closing the folder. "Good," Grayson said, leaning back in his chair. "And Bennett, don't disappoint me." The unexpected encounter. As Marcus left the estate, his thoughts were already on the next steps. He knew the delivery was a trap, a way for Steele to gauge his loyalty. But he also knew it was an opportunity, a chance to gather intel and get closer to the heart of the operation. However, as he walked to his car, he spotted a familiar figure standing by the gates. Aisha. She stood tall, her arms crossed, her chin lifted. Her short, uneven hair caught the sunlight, and her expression was one of quiet defiance. "What are you doing here?" Marcus asked, his voice low and urgent. "I needed to see it for myself," Aisha said. "The people you're fighting, the world you're trying to protect me from." Marcus glanced around, making sure they weren't being watched. "This isn't a game, Aisha. These people are dangerous." "So am I," she said, her voice steady. "You taught me to fight, Dad. You taught me to stand up for myself. Let me help you." Marcus hesitated, torn between his instinct to protect her and the undeniable truth in her words. Finally, he nodded. "Stay close," he said, "and follow my lead." As they walked back to the car together, Marcus realized something. The battle ahead was no longer just his. It was theirs. Into the lion's den. The night air was thick with tension as Marcus and Aisha drove in silence. The glow of the city lights faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the shadowy outskirts where Marcus's assignment awaited. The manila folder sat on the dashboard, its contents weighing heavily on Marcus's mind. He glanced at Aisha, who stared out the window, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have come," Marcus said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was low, but carried a tinge of worry. Aisha turned to him, her gaze steady. "You always told me to face challenges head-on, to fight for what's right. How can I sit at home knowing you're out here risking everything? I won't be a bystander." Marcus sighed, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He had raised his daughter to be fearless, but her courage now felt like a double-edged sword. "This isn't about bravery, Aisha. These people, they don't just hurt you physically, they destroy lives. If anything happens to you—" "It won't," she interrupted, her voice firm. "You taught me better than that." Her determination both frustrated and inspired Marcus. He knew there was no convincing her to turn back now. He had to trust her, just as she was trusting him. The drop-off. The address in the folder led them to a dilapidated warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. The building loomed in the darkness, its broken windows and rusted exterior, a stark reminder of the lawless world Marcus had infiltrated. Aisha stayed in the car as instructed, her hands clenched in her lap. Marcus handed her a burner phone. "If anything feels off, call this number," he said, locking eyes with her. "Don't hesitate. Don't wait for me." Aisha nodded, her jaw tight. "Be careful." Marcus stepped out, the cool night air biting at his skin. He adjusted his jacket, feeling the weight of the cash-filled package concealed inside. His steps echoed against the cracked pavement as he approached the warehouse. A single light flickered above the entrance, casting eerie shadows. The steel door creaked open, and Victor Steele emerged, flanked by two menacing figures. Victor's piercing eyes locked onto Marcus, scanning him for any hint of doubt or hesitation. "You're late," Victor said, his tone icy. "Traffic," Marcus replied smoothly, holding up the package. "I assume this is the right place." Victor smirked but didn't respond. He gestured for Marcus to follow him inside. The interior of the warehouse was surprisingly organized, with rows of crates stacked neatly along the walls. A table stood in the center, illuminated by a single overhead bulb. Marcus placed the package on the table and stepped back, keeping his expression neutral. One of Victor's men opened the package, revealing the neatly stacked bills. He nodded to Victor, who gave Marcus a slow clap. "Not bad," Victor said, his smirk widening. "But anyone can deliver money. Let's see how you handle something bigger." Victor snapped his fingers, and the two men stepped forward, placing another package on the table. This one was larger, heavier, and wrapped in brown paper. Marcus felt his stomach tighten as Victor pushed it toward him. "This goes to 1820 Harbor Street," Victor said. "No questions, no detours. If you can handle this, you're in." Marcus nodded, hiding his unease. "Understood." But as he turned to leave, Victor's voice stopped him. "One more thing." Marcus froze, his hand on the door. "You're a cop, aren't you?" Victor said, his tone casual but deadly. Marcus turned slowly, his face an unreadable mask. "Why would you think that?" Victor stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. You move like a cop, you talk like a cop, and you're too damn calm for someone in this line of work. Marcus held Victor's gaze, his mind racing. I used to be a cop, he admitted, his voice steady. But I got sick of the bureaucracy. Sick of the system protecting the wrong people. That's why I'm here. Victor studied him for a long moment before nodding. Fair enough. But if I find out you're lying... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The unexpected encounter. As Marcus stepped outside, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and saw a single message from an untraceable number. Watch your back. His chest tightened. Someone within the network suspected him, perhaps Victor, or someone even higher up. He had to be more careful. He reached the car, where Aisha waited anxiously. Everything okay? She asked as he climbed in. Define okay, Marcus muttered, starting the engine. We have another delivery to make. Aisha frowned but didn't press him. She could sense his unease, and it unsettled her. What's in the package? Marcus shook his head. I don't know, and I'm not supposed to. But whatever it is, it's important enough to test my loyalty. As they drove toward the next address, Marcus noticed a car following them at a distance. His instincts kicked in, and he took a sudden left turn down a narrow alley. The car behind them hesitated before following. We're being tailed, Marcus said, his voice low. Aisha's eyes widened, but she stayed calm. What do we do? Marcus scanned the street ahead, spotting an empty parking garage. Hold on. He swerved into the garage, cutting the lights and pulling into a dark corner. The car following them drove past, its headlights sweeping across the entrance before disappearing down the road. Marcus exhaled, his grip on the steering wheel loosening. They're testing me, watching every move I make. Aisha reached out, her hand resting on his arm. You'll get through this, Dad, we both will. Her words steadied him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. Harbour Street. The address led them to an abandoned storefront on Harbour Street. Marcus parked a block away, instructing Aisha to stay hidden in the car. This won't take long, he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The storefront was dark, the windows boarded up. Marcus knocked twice on the door, and it creaked open to reveal a man with a scar running down the side of his face. He looked Marcus up and down before stepping aside, motioning for him to enter. Inside, the air was heavy with tension. A group of men stood around a table covered in maps and documents. The scarred man gestured for Marcus to place the package on the table. As one of the men opened it, Marcus's heart sank. Inside were stacks of unmarked firearms, gleaming under the dim light. This shipment needs to be moved tonight, the scarred man said, his voice gravelly. You're in charge of distribution. Marcus nodded, keeping his expression neutral. Understood. But as the men turned their attention back to the table, Marcus's eyes flicked to the corner of the room, where a small surveillance camera was mounted on the wall. He recognized it instantly as one of the hidden devices planted by his team during a previous operation. They were already watching this location. This wasn't just a test of his loyalty, it was a potential breakthrough. He left the building, his mind racing. Back at the car, Aisha looked up expectantly. What happened? Marcus didn't answer immediately. He started the engine and drove away, his thoughts a whirlwind of plans and contingencies. Finally, he spoke. We're closer than we've ever been, Aisha. But this just got a lot more dangerous. Aisha nodded, her expression determined. Then we'll face it together. Marcus glanced at her, his chest swelling with pride and fear. She was his greatest strength and his greatest vulnerability. As the city lights blurred past them, he knew one thing for certain: the fight ahead would demand everything they had. The reckoning. The city was alive with a restless energy as Marcus drove toward the safe house on the edge of town. Rain began to fall, the droplets pattering against the windshield like a ticking clock. Time was running out. The delivery to Harbour Street had pushed the operation into dangerous new territory, and now Marcus had to make a choice: expose the network before they grew suspicious of him, or wait for the perfect moment and risk everything. The stakes had never been higher. Beside him, Aisha sat in quiet contemplation, her hands resting on the burner phone he'd given her. The tension in the car was palpable, the silence punctuated only by the rhythm of the rain. "Dad," Aisha finally said, breaking the quiet, "what happens if they find out?" Marcus didn't take his eyes off the road. "If they find out, things will get dangerous. Fast. That's why you're going to stay at the safe house until this is over." Aisha frowned. "We've been through this. I'm not sitting on the sidelines." "This isn't a recital, Aisha," Marcus snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. He immediately softened. "I can't lose you. Not to them." "You won't," she replied, her voice steady. "But you have to trust me. I'm not just your daughter. I'm someone who can help you." Marcus wanted to argue, but the determination in her eyes silenced him. She had inherited his resilience, his stubbornness. He nodded reluctantly. "Fine. But if I tell you to run, you run. No questions." Aisha nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. The network exposed. The safe house was a modest apartment tucked in a quiet corner of the city. Inside, Marcus opened his laptop and connected to a secure server. The surveillance footage from the Harbor Street storefront was already waiting for him. He clicked through the timestamps, his jaw tightening as he watched men load unmarked crates into vans. "This is it," Marcus muttered to himself. "This is the proof we need." Aisha leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the screen. "Who's that?" she asked, pointing to a man in a grey suit who appeared to be giving orders. "That's Nathaniel Grayson," Marcus said, his voice tinged with both anger and satisfaction. "The head of the entire operation. If we take him down, the network collapses." He picked up his phone and dialed Captain Monroe. The line rang twice before the captain's gruff voice answered. "What do you have?" "Everything," Marcus replied. "Surveillance footage, delivery schedules, the whole operation. Grayson's running weapons and drugs through the South District, and I got him on tape." There was a pause on the other end. "Good work," Monroe said finally. "But this isn't enough. We need Grayson in the act. Can you bait him into showing up at another drop?" Marcus hesitated. "It's risky. If they suspect anything." "They won't," Monroe interrupted. "You've built trust. Use it." Marcus glanced at Aisha, who was watching him intently. He nodded. "Fine, I'll set it up." The bait. The next day, Marcus returned to the Grayson estate, carrying the confidence of a man who had been tested and proven himself. Victor Steele greeted him at the gates with his usual suspicious glare, but let him in without a word. Grayson was waiting in the study, his demeanor as polished and dangerous as ever. "Bennett," Grayson said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I have a proposal," Marcus replied, keeping his tone casual. "The operation at Harbor Street went smoothly, but I noticed something. The cops are sniffing around. If we don't act fast, they'll be all over us." Grayson's smile faded. "And your solution?" "We moved the next shipment to a new location," Marcus said, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. "I've already scouted it. No patrols, no cameras, and easy access to the highway." Grayson studied the paper for a moment before nodding. "You've proven yourself, Bennett. I'll trust your judgment on this." Marcus hid his relief as Grayson turned to Victor. "Coordinate the details. Make sure this goes off without a hitch." Victor nodded, his expression unreadable. Marcus knew the man didn't trust him, but for now, he was in. The trap. The chosen location was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was the perfect place for a sting operation. Marcus coordinated with Monroe to have the warehouse rigged with hidden cameras and microphones. SWAT teams would be stationed nearby, ready to move in the moment Grayson and his men arrived. As the day of the drop approached, Marcus's nerves were on edge. Aisha insisted on coming with him, arguing that she could monitor the operation from the van outside. Despite his misgivings, Marcus agreed, Her presence was both a comfort and a source of anxiety. The night of the drop, Marcus arrived early, ensuring everything was in place. He stood in the shadows of the warehouse, his heart pounding as the first vans rolled in. Grayson's men began unloading crates, their movements efficient and practiced. Victor Steele was there, overseeing the operation with his usual intensity. And then Grayson arrived. He stepped out of a sleek black car, his gray suit immaculate even in the dim light. He surveyed the scene with a cold, calculating gaze before approaching Marcus. "Everything looks good," Grayson said, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. "You've done well." Marcus forced a smile. "Just doing my job." Grayson turned to Victor. "Make sure the shipment gets out on time. I don't want any surprises." Victor nodded, but his eyes lingered on Marcus for a moment too long. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Did Victor suspect something? The raid. Just as the last crate was loaded onto the vans, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Red and blue lights flooded the warehouse, casting chaotic shadows on the walls. Grayson's men scrambled, some reaching for weapons, others trying to flee. "Everyone freeze," a voice boomed over a megaphone. "This is the police. Drop your weapons and surrender." Grayson's calm demeanor cracked as he turned to Marcus, his eyes blazing with fury. "You set us up." Marcus didn't deny it. "It's over, Grayson. There's nowhere to run." Victor lunged at Marcus, but Marcus was ready. He sidestepped the attack, using Victor's momentum to slam him against a crate. They grappled briefly before Marcus gained the upper hand, pinning Victor to the ground. SWAT teams flooded the warehouse, taking down Grayson's men one by one. Grayson himself was handcuffed and led away, his once imposing figure reduced to a broken man. As the dust settled, Marcus stepped outside to find Isa waiting in the van. She ran to him, her arms wrapping around his waist. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with pride. "We did it," Marcus corrected, his voice heavy with relief. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his mission lifting. The aftermath. In the weeks that followed, the takedown of the Grayson network made headlines. Dozens of arrests were made, and the city began to heal from the damage caused by the criminal empire. Malone was suspended pending investigation, and Monroe initiated sweeping reforms within the precinct. But for Marcus, the real victory was Aisha. She had faced injustice and humiliation, but she had emerged stronger. Together, they had fought for what was right, and together they had won. One evening, as Aisha played a new composition on her piano, Marcus sat in the living room, listening to the melody. It was a song of resilience, a song of hope. And as the final notes filled the air, Marcus smiled, knowing that this was only the beginning of a brighter future.